May 27th, 2025, with atmospheric carbon dioxide at roughly 430.36 parts per million, up from 315 parts per million in 1958. Speaking at the Australian gas industry's annual conference in Brisbane, the CEO of energy giant Woodside, Meg O'Neill, tried to stiffen the spines of her fellow fossil fuel activists by attacking young people who were taking what she called an ideological stand against fossil fuels. As Graham Redfern of The Guardian Australia reports, she suggested the young are hypocrites for ordering cheap online consumer goods, quote, without any sort of recognition of the energy and carbon impact of their actions, end quote. I want to give two bits of context. First, historical about the gas industry's response to climate change, and secondly, about the nature of these trade events. It was not always like this. In the late 1980s, when the greenhouse effect, which we now call climate change, was first a hot political issue, the Australian gas industry's initial interest was to undercut coal. This continued in the late 90s when the Australian Gas Association, one of the peak trade bodies at the time, was led by Bill Nagel, who saw gas as cleaner than coal. He broke with the Australian Industry Greenhouse Network in late 1999. Coal interests were not impressed at this show of disunity. As described in the 2007 book High and Dry by Guy Pearce, Nagel was warned by a senior Minerals Council figure. You know, you pursue this hard line, and you scratch the coal industry too much harder, and they will come out, and we will start talking about nitrous oxide emissions, methane, or pipe leakages. Don't do it, because if you do, we'll have a big brawl between the energy industries in this country in the public arena, which won't do anybody any good. Nagel's efforts to reorient the Australian Gas Association failed. Secondly, on these conferences, they act as a watering hole for lobbyists to rub shoulders with ministers, for trial balloons to be flown, and carefully honed publicity slogans to begin their journey towards common sense, being repeated by journalists, politicians, and other thought leaders. The Australian Coal Association, now defunct, used to run biannual conferences. In 1990, much of the talk was given over to the greenhouse effect, including speakers saying it wasn't real, and, if it were, what might be done to either blame shift or even, take technical steps. Conferences like these also allow inadequate and or has-been journalists the chance to feel important by their proximity to power and wealth, and it provides cheap, pre-written copy. So it's a win-win all round, except for, checks notes, the planet. By the way, for more details about the gas industry, you can check out Royce Kermelov's recent book Slick and various reports of the Australia Institute on how much, or little, tax the gas giants pay and who benefits. So what is the incumbent strategy on display here? What O'Neill said is a very well-established rhetorical technique. This process of infantilising critics, ignoring the strongest or most socially powerful critics, and instead aiming fire at children, is clever, devious, and cynical. By framing climate change as an issue that young people, with their silly views and silly consumer habits, are concerned with, rather than something scientists have been studying and warning about for over 35 years, that the Secretary-General of the United Nations, the late Pope Francis, and countless others have screamed themselves hoarse over, O'Neill is setting up a straw man and knocking it down. O'Neill is ducking and weaving away from the substantive issues that actual adults would need to confront because she has nothing else. If Woodside is to continue making profits, it will have to keep extracting and selling fossil fuels that will be burnt, and the carbon dioxide from those long molecules of gas will be released into the atmosphere, trapping heat. She knows this, and she also knows that carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal are, even if they are frankly solutions, will be tiny ones. Ultimately, O'Neill is deploying a version of what I call the hypocrite zealot trap. If a critic benefits from fossil fuels, they can be dismissed as a hypocrite. If they are vegan, never flew, never drove, they can be dismissed as a zealot. So, what are the earliest, clearest examples of this incumbent strategy being deployed, either on climate or in another context? This trivialisation of opponents and this willful ignorance is not new. In fact, it predates the battles over climate and environment, which are laid out in Naomi Oreskes and Stephen Conwell's magisterial 2010 work, Merchants of Doubt. If you want to look at how incumbent trade associations and supporters of what now regarded as horrific practices, slavery, child labour, etc., defend themselves, I would strongly recommend the 1950 book Roads to Ruin, A Shocking History of Social Progress by E.S. Turner. So, how has this strategy been challenged, delayed, defeated in the past? How to respond? How does one challenge these techniques? Well, simply by naming them. That's a start. By explaining, in clear, vivid and non-technical terms, what O'Neill and others are trying to do makes it riskier for her and her colleagues to repeat the same trick again. But that can't come from the young because it will look like special pleading. The pushback, the description, has to come from adults, and preferably ones with scientific and/or business credentials. What powers would be needed to combat this incumbent strategy and put it in the too costly or not effective space? There's a new expression doing the rounds. Every accusation is a confession. While I don't think that's always true, I do think it holds in this case. On some level, presumably, O'Neill knows what she is doing. She is the child here, refusing to accept realities that would force her to stop doing what she wants. Those she accuses of being children, they are the adults. What is required is a properly grown-up conversation about where we find ourselves, at 430 parts per million and rising, and why we are here, why almost 40 years of scientific and political concern about climate change has in no meaningful way worked. This would require independent media, brave professionals, brave professional bodies, social movement organisations and political parties that were not made up of mostly meat puppets for extraction. What makes the creation, maintenance, extension of that power more difficult? Well, everything. Look, it seems unlikely, given the last 40 years, that we are going to start being grown-ups now, when the social inducements to fantasies of techno-salvation and explicit and implicit denial become more and more attractive. But who knows? I could be wrong.